The auctioneer's gavel came down at 10:17 on a Tuesday morning in March, and the sound of it was smaller than she expected. Not a crack, a knock. The kind a knuckle makes against a hollow door, $7. 80 acres of dead grass and a house the locals called the Coffin. A barn leaning toward the earth like something that had already decided to a fall. A dirt road that turned to gravel that turned to nothing, winding through fields that hadn't been touched in 6 years. She was 18 years old. She had $40 left in her pocket. And somewhere on those 80 acres, in a room no one had opened since a woman who loved her died alone, was the reason her mother had run, had never come back, had kept a photograph until the day she didn't wake up. The receipt was still warm from the printer when the man across the county road saw her sign her name. He had been watching. He had been watching for a long time. The gavel came down at 10:17 on a Tuesday morning in March, and the sound of it was smaller than Katie had expected. Not a crack. More like a knock, the kind of sound a knuckle makes against a hollow door. Which was appropriate, she would think later, because that was exactly what it was. A door. The only one that had ever opened in her direction without requiring something from her first, $7. She stood at the front of a room that smelled like 1987 and held her receipt in both hands so they wouldn't shake visibly and thought, "This is either the best decision you have ever made or the last one that will ever matter." And the thing was, she didn't know which. Couldn't know which. Because the math didn't work from the outside and she understood that, and had done it anyway. Which was either courage or stupidity, and the line between those two things had always been thinner than people admitted in polite company. 90 days, $1,500, $40 in her pocket. The clerk handed her a set of keys, so rusted they felt archaeological. "Congratulations," he said, without warmth whatsoever, and she appreciated the honesty of that, more than she would have appreciated the performance of something warmer. She walked out into the March sun of Harlan, Montana, and stood on the courthouse steps and let herself breathe for exactly 1 full minute. This was hers now, all 80 acres of it. The dead grass and the burst pipes and the roof with a hole in it visible from the county road. The barn that leaned like something that had given up on vertical years ago and decided east was fine. The truck in the garage that hadn't started since 2012 and had been sitting in its rust and its silence, waiting for someone to come back and apologize for abandoning it. Hers the words sat in her chest like a coin from a country she'd never visited. Real, clearly real, but the correct way to hold it not yet obvious. She started walking. 2 hours to the property on a dirt road with March wind at her back, which was either the universe being kind or the universe being indifferent and the wind happening to blow south. She had stopped trying to distinguish between those two possibilities around age 9. The farm came up on her gradually. First, just a shape against the horizon, gray-white in the late morning light, something that could have been a building or a geological feature from a distance. Then more specific. The house resolving out of the distance with its sagging roofline and dark windows, and the porch that had folded in on one side like a paperback left open in the rain. She stood at the end of the drive for probably 3 full minutes. Not frozen, just looking. Taking inventory the way you take inventory when the stakes are real and you need your eyes to be accurate before your feelings get involved and start editorializing. The paint had peeled off the clapboards in long curling strips, as if the house had been attempting to molt for years and hadn't quite managed it. 3 upper windows were open holes, no glass, just the particular quality of darkness that empty frames make. The porch post on the left side was gone entirely, and the roofline above it had responded to that loss by sloping downward at a degree that made the whole facade look like a face caught mid-wince. The roof itself, above the kitchen wing, had an actual gap. Not a soft spot, a gap. Sky visible through it from the road. Behind the house the barn leaned east, committed to east. Not ambivalent, not in the process of deciding. Committed, and everywhere the grass had come back. Chest high in places, swallowing what used to be a garden bed, erasing what used to be a path. Absorbing the evidence of human effort the way prairie always will, given enough seasons and enough absence of the people who were supposed to be tending it. Katie took a long breath, let it out slowly. Then she walked toward the house, because she had tried the other option. 2 years of the other option. 2 years of diners and orchards and motel rooms and bus stations, and one November behind a laundromat with frost in her hair by morning. 2 years of demonstrating that motion and survival were not the same thing. And she knew, in the way the body knows things before the brain finishes its paperwork, that she was done moving. The front door was not locked because the front door had warped so far from its original geometry that it could no longer perform the basic mechanical function of closing. She pushed it and it swung, and the smell came out at her. Mold, yes, and something sweeter underneath, the particular sweetness of a place that has been sealed long enough to begin the slower process of returning to the earth it was built from. She tested every step before committing her weight to it. The living room had good bones. She could see it even through the damage. High ceiling. Stone fireplace still structurally intact. Windows on 3 sides that would have flooded the room with light in another life. The plaster had failed and the floor had soft spots, and something had built a nest in the corner over multiple winters. But the bones were good. She said it out loud, to nobody in that empty room, because sometimes the only witness you have is yourself, and a thing still deserves to be named. The kitchen was worse. The back bedroom was not worth describing in detail. The upstairs she assessed from the doorway without going in, which was the correct decision structurally. The back room on the ground floor was where she found the first evidence that a human life had genuinely happened in this place. A bookshelf still standing, still full. A rocking chair with its cushion destroyed but its joints intact and solid. A basket of wool that had been expensive once and was still useful. And photographs framed hung in a cluster on the wall. Black and white, the edges faded to something warmer than their original tone, faces she couldn't name but shapes she recognized. The broad jaw of the Holt line, the way a certain mouth pressed closed, when the subject didn't want to be photographed but sat still for it anyway, because the picture mattered even if the sitting didn't feel natural, and in the center of the wall. A single frame, silver, slightly tarnished at the edges, hung alone, a little apart from the others, given space the way you give space to something that means more than the things around it. A young woman standing in front of this house, tawny hair loose in the wind, pale skin, freckles across the bridge of the nose, the cheekbones, scattered like punctuations, across a face that was still in the process of becoming what it would eventually be. One hand lifted to shade her eyes from a sun that must have been low and coming in from the west, smiling the kind of smile that isn't for the camera, that exists despite the camera. The smile of a person who is looking at something they love and hasn't thought yet about how the expression will read to someone else. Olivia Holt, 22 years old in this photograph maybe, or younger, the kind of young that doesn't know yet how brief it's going to be. Katie reached out and touched the glass, cool under her fingertips, dust on the frame, everything else in this room moving toward entropy, and this photograph still hanging, still centered, still given its particular space. Her mother had stood in this room. The understanding of that was not dramatic. It didn't arrive with fanfare. It dropped into her body the way certain truths do, quietly, settling into a permanent position rather than a temporary one, and the body responding not with performance, but with the simple physical fact of having received something it had been waiting for, without knowing it was waiting. Katie sat down on the floor, and she cried the kind of crying that doesn't have an audience and doesn't need one. The kind stored in the body's less accessible places, and released when the right combination of exhaustion and recognition and grief finally forces the lock. She cried until she was empty. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve, stood up, looked at the photograph one more time, and went to find the barn. The barn answered questions about itself pretty efficiently. The main structure was beyond her without serious equipment and serious money, neither of which existed in her current situation. The roof on the east side had already come in. The west wall had bowed outward from moisture damage, then frozen and refrozen until the joints had given up the argument. You could see sky through multiple points in the remaining roof, and the smell inside was the smell of organic decomposition, hay and animal waste and wood returning slowly to what wood came from. The floor, though the floor was still there, planks warped and filthy but present. She walked it slowly, staying near the walls where the structure was most likely to hold weight, looking for something she couldn't have named precisely. Just some irregularity. Some place where the floor was different from itself. Some hint that the ground beneath had been shaped by intention rather than accident. She was in the second stall when her boot caught on something, a metal ring set into the floor. She had walked past it twice and taken it for a piece of broken hardware, which was the reasonable conclusion. Except that when she crouched down and brushed the grime away from the surrounding boards, the ring was not broken hardware. It was a handle, and the boards around it were cut in a pattern. A seam running the perimeter of a shape about 4 feet square, so faint under the accumulated filth that you would never see it unless you were looking for something to see. She pulled. Her arms burned. Her back objected formally. The hatch had not been opened in years, and the friction of swollen wood against wood was the friction of something that had settled into its position and had no interest in being disturbed, but it came, an inch. Two then, with a sound like a long exhale from something that had been holding its breath since 2012, the hatch lifted. The smell that came up from below was different from the barn smell above. Dry, cool, controlled. The smell of a place that had been maintained by someone who understood that certain things needed to last. Below, wooden stairs. Darkness. Her phone had 12% battery. She used the flashlight function and went down. The room below was 8 feet by 8. The walls were lined with shelving, and the shelves still held what had been placed on them. Canned goods, some of which she would spend an anxious hour researching online later to determine whether they were still viable. Tools wrapped in oiled cloth. Seed jars, sealed, labeled in a handwriting she didn't recognize yet but would come to know well. A lantern, matches in a waterproof container, a first aid kit, and on the small table against the far wall, a metal box. Katie sat on the bottom step and looked at the box for a moment before she opened it, because she understood that what was inside would change the shape of what came next, and of what had come before. And she needed one moment before that happened, one moment where the past was still unclear enough to be anything. Then she opened it. $1,100 in cash, mostly 20s and 10s, rubber banded in bundles, the rubber bands crumbling when she touched them. An amount calculated to be useful rather than extravagant. Enough to keep someone alive and working long enough to find their footing. A leather journal, its cover dark with age and use. 47 letters in individual envelopes, all addressed to Olivia Holt, all marked return to sender in the red ink of a postal system that had no way of knowing the address wasn't the problem, all in the same careful handwriting, the handwriting of a person who had decided that neatness was a form of respect, even when the recipient wasn't there to see it, and beneath the letters, tied with a ribbon that had once been pink and was now a color without an available name, 13 birthday cards, each one addressed to Katie. She opened the first one, the 5th birthday, hand-drawn flowers along the border, the petals slightly uneven in the way of someone who drew carefully rather than naturally, but drew anyway because the recipient deserved the effort regardless of whether the execution matched the intention. I don't know where you are. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I made you a card because somewhere in the world you are turning 5 today, and someone should be marking that. She opened the next, the 6th birthday, the 7th. The 8th mentioned a hard winter and a new calf, and the particular quality of the light through the east window in February mornings, the way it made the kitchen floor look lit from underneath, as if the details of an ordinary day could cross the distance between an old woman and a granddaughter she'd never met. As if sharing what the light looked like that morning was a way of sharing the morning itself across the impossible gap between them. The 13th, the 15th, the 17th, and then the last one, the handwriting had changed. Still the same person, still recognizable, but the hand behind it had aged, had developed a slight tremor, had pressed harder in some places, as if trying to compensate for uncertainty by adding force. You are a woman now, old enough to find your way home. I have left everything for you, the money, the letters, the land. It is all waiting. Please come home. I don't have much time left, but I will hold on as long as I can. I love you. I have always loved you. 11 days. Richard Miller would tell her this later, and she would sit with it for a long time. Margaret Holt had lived exactly 11 days after writing those words. She had held on as long as she could. Katie sat in that underground room with the cards spread around her on the floor and the cash on the table and the journal in her lap. She didn't cry this time. She had used that up in the back room of the house. What she felt now was something harder and quieter. Something that had weight but no moisture. Something that was done forming and had set into its final shape. She opened the journal. She had not expected what she found. The journal was not a diary. There was nothing in it about loneliness or hope or the particular quality of February light. There was nothing soft in it at all. It was a record. Dates and names and observations. Conversations overheard at the feed store. License plates noted with make and model and time of day and which road. Property surveys copied by hand in the margins. Tax records. Photographs tucked between pages, taken through windows with a camera held very still against the glass. Photographs of trucks and men and gate meetings that were not supposed to be meetings at all. And everywhere, on page after page, the same name, Donald Thomas. She read until her phone died, and then she read by the lantern from the shelf, which still had oil in it, and lit on the third match. She kept reading after that through the first year of records. The second, the decade mark, passed it. Thomas at Margaret's gate in 1985, offering a number and a smile and the assumption that an aging woman on a working farm would be grateful for the liquidity. Margaret's notation. He smiled like I'd told him a joke. Thomas in 1989 with a higher number. This time he didn't get out of the truck. Just sat in the drive looking at the house for 11 minutes before leaving. Margaret had timed it. Thomas in 1992 at the Ashby property, the week before that sale completed, asking questions at the county assessor's office about a valuation he already knew. The neighbor who sold was 81 and getting forgetful. His son had told anyone who would listen that Gerald hadn't understood the papers. And then the entries about Olivia, written in smaller letters, pressed closer to the margins, as if even on the page, Margaret was trying to take up less space with this particular grief. She came home crying, won't say what happened. Thomas's truck was on the river road this week. Then, she says she has evidence, won't show me what. Says it could put a man like him away if anyone would listen. I told her to take it to the sheriff. She says the sheriff is Thomas's cousin. She's right. I don't know what to tell her. Then, in handwriting that was not trembling from age, she's gone, left a note. Said she had to go before he hurt me too. Said she would come back. Said she loved me, a blank page. Then months of entries that were only dates and temperatures and what the weather did. The minimum of documentation. A person maintaining records because records were the only control she had left, even when the records were only February 14 cold, snow overnight, March 3 warmer, first the calves. Catty read every page. She climbed out of the hiding place when the lantern started to dim and stood in the ruined barn in the dark and looked up through the gap in the roof at a sky full of Montana stars, which were the densest and most matter-of-fact stars she had ever seen, stars that didn't perform their abundance but simply had it. The original homestead papers are with Richard. That was the last line of the journal, written in a hand that was failing and still somehow more deliberate than anything preceding it. Richard, just a first name, no surname, no address, but Margaret had left a path, deliberately, methodically, the cash to cover the taxes and keep someone alive long enough to follow the path, the journal to explain why, and somewhere in Harlan County, a man named Richard, who had been holding the final piece for long enough that he might have stopped expecting anyone to come for it. She slept in the truck that night, Margaret's Chevrolet, parked in the garage behind the house, rusted and dusty but dry inside, the seats cracked but not moldy, the engine didn't run. But the cab was shelter, and shelter was enough for the night. The next morning the library opened at 9 and she was at the door at 8:45. The librarian, whose name was Doris, and who appeared to staff both the library and the county clerk's office, depending on what the hour required, looked at Katie's request without visible surprise. She was looking for a Richard associated with the Holt property or with law enforcement in Harlan County. Retired, probably in his 70s. Doris typed something. Turned the monitor slightly. Richard Miller, former sheriff of Harlan County, 1988 to 2014. Address on record, County Road 7, approximately 6 miles east of Harlan Township. County Road 7 was 2 ruts in the grass that had been given a name and a sign and left to develop its own character. She drove them in Margaret's truck, which she'd gotten running that morning on the 4th attempt, and a YouTube video about carburetors that she'd watched twice in the library parking lot, and the engine expressed its continued objections through a sound in the exhaust system that she was choosing to classify as personality rather than mechanical failure. The cabin was small, cedar siding weathered to silver, a stone chimney, a porch with a single rocking chair, and in the rocking chair, a man with a book and a cup of coffee who watched her truck come down the track and did not stand up or change his posture in any way, which was the posture of someone who has been waiting for something long enough to have stopped bracing for the moment it arrived. She parked and got out and crossed the yard. "My name is Katie Holt," she said, standing at the bottom of his porch steps. "Margaret Holt was my great-great-grandmother. She left a note that said you'd be holding something for me." Richard Miller set his book down, set his coffee down, looked at her with eyes that had spent 26 years assessing people in official capacities, and had not lost the skill in retirement. "I've been waiting for you 20 years, he said. "Come inside." The inside of the cabin was books in deliberate order, shelves on every wall, a desk by the window, clear-surfaced, with a green tin army trunk sitting on it under a folded wool blanket. He pulled the blanket back. The trunk had the patina of something touched regularly, the kind of surface that comes from being taken out and checked and put back again, over and over across years. He had maintained his readiness. Through every year of his retirement, he had kept the trunk where he could reach it and kept himself current on the legal mechanisms that would be required to use its contents. Not because he was certain the moment would arrive, because the alternative was not being ready when it did. He was a careful man. She understood that immediately and completely. He told her about the night in 1998 without being asked. About a 17-year-old girl walking into his office with a folder and a composure that must have cost her everything. About what she'd brought, a recording she'd made herself from another room, tape running while Thomas met with someone at a relative's kitchen table. Photographs, a record of dates and movements and specific incidents. The kind of evidence a prosecutor with backbone could have made something from. He had told her to come back the next day. The call came that night. Sheriff Calvin Thomas, Donald Thomas's first cousin. The conversation had been brief and had not been a conversation in any meaningful sense. It had been a set of instructions delivered with the specific weight of consequences. If he valued his career and his family's safety, he would forget he had met that girl. He handed over the file. He told himself he'd find another way. By the time he went looking for Olivia, 2 weeks later, she was already gone, 3 days after she disappeared. I drove out to Margaret's farm, Richard said. I told her everything. I told her I'd failed her granddaughter. I told her I'd resign by the end of the month. Katie waited. She told me to stay. She said, "Be where you can see things. Write down what you see. One day someone will come back and need someone who was there." He looked at his hands on the table. She said she would do the same. That if they were both patient, if they both kept records, then one day the weight of 30 years of documentation would be more than one man's position in a county could hold. And you believed her. I believed that she was right about what needed doing. Whether or not I believed the moment would actually arrive. He stood up. I stayed until 2014. Retired at 70. Walked out of that office with everything I'd kept and brought it here. He opened the trunk. Inside, folders, dozens of them, dense with paper and organized by year. Photographs in plastic sleeves. Cassette tapes labeled in Margaret's handwriting and in Richard's blockier print. A bound ledger of property records. A second ledger of names. A third of dates and times, and the license plates of trucks that had no business being where they were at the hours they were there. And at the bottom of the trunk, an oilcloth bundle, flat and long, tied with heavy cord. The 1923 federal homestead papers, Richard said, filed by your great-great-great-grandfather under the Homestead Act of 1862. Margaret gave them to me in 2009. She said she didn't want them anywhere Thomas could access them. He set the bundle on the table between them without unwrapping it. These papers are why he's going to lose. But you're not ready to hear that part yet. There are things you need to build before the foundation makes sense. She looked at the bundle. I want to hear it now. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite a smile. I know you do. Come back next week. We'll start from the beginning. She drove home with the image of the trunk's contents arranged in her mind, like the inventory of a place she hadn't fully understood yet, but was going to have to learn. The farm was still there when she came back over the last rise. Still broken, still improbable. The late afternoon light was hitting the west-facing wall and making the peeled paint look almost intentional, like texture, like a choice someone had made, rather than a consequence of 6 years of neglect. She parked and sat in the truck for a full minute. Then she got out and went to look at the roof. Because the roof was what needed looking at next, and looking at the next thing was what you did. 3 weeks after buying the farm, Katie walked into Callaway Feed and Hardware and met Barbara Garcia. She had driven Margaret's truck the 2-hour trip to Harlan for the first time, the engine rattling its objections at every rut, and she had parked in front of the feed store. Because it was the kind of store that would have nails and tar paper and possibly the willingness to discuss payment arrangements with someone who had $17 and a very specific situation. The bell above the door announced her arrival. The woman behind the counter did not look up immediately, which gave Katie 4 full seconds to take her in before the assessment began going the other direction. 71 years old, maybe. White hair cut close to the skull with the no-nonsense of someone who had decided long ago that hair was a resource, not a performance. Hands on the counter that looked like they'd been carved from something organic and left to cure for a decade. Pale blue eyes that, when they finally came up from the ledger, landed on Katie with the specific quality of a weather instrument. "You're the one who bought the Holt place." Not a question. "Yes, ma'am, how much?" $7. Something moved in Barbara Garcia's face. Not surprise, which would have been the wrong instrument for this. Something more like a lock turning over after a long time in the same position. "You know Margaret Holt. She was my great-great-grandmother. I found out 3 days ago when I found her records at the county library. I drove straight here. The silence that followed had weight. The kind you don't feel, because filling it would cost something neither person had agreed to spend yet." Barbara's hands stayed flat on the counter. Her eyes didn't leave Katie's face. "I knew that woman 60 years, she finally said. "Every Thursday. Supplies and conversation. When she couldn't drive anymore, I brought things out to her. A pause that was doing real work. She talked about Olivia, her granddaughter, the one who left. She never stopped believing Olivia would come back. Olivia was my mother. She died when I was 4. Barbara went very still. The kind of stillness that has a price attached to it. Margaret didn't know that. No, I know she didn't. I read her letters. Another pause. Longer. Outside, a truck rolled past on the empty main street. A bird landed on the windowsill and left without explaining itself. "She would have turned the world inside out to find you," Barbara said. And that was the whole of it. No performance, no softening. Just the truth laid flat. The way someone lays a thing down when they've been carrying it for too long. Katie didn't have words for that. Barbara didn't seem to require them. "What did you come in for?" "Nails. Tar paper. Whatever $17 will reach." Barbara turned toward the door at the back of the store. "I've got damaged stock. Tarps with small holes. Nails that got wet and rusted. Not worth selling, still usable if you're not particular." "I'm not particular about anything at this point." "Come on then." That was the economy of it. No fanfare, no extended kindness. Just a 71-year-old woman who had known Margaret Holt for 60 years, turning her back and walking toward the supply room, trusting that Katie would follow. She followed. The back of the store smelled even better than the front. The working smells of a place where actual work happened, undiluted. Shelving floor to ceiling, feed bags in columns. A workbench against the far wall with tools hung above it in the order of someone who had never lost anything and had no plans to start. And at the far end, someone unloading 50-pound bags from a hand truck. 2 at a time, with the specific ease of a person for whom weight had long ago stopped being a relevant variable. Timothy Clark, 23 years old, tall, dark hair. A face with the economy of someone who has decided to keep the parts that are useful and not maintain the rest. He glanced at Katie the way a person glances at a weather report for a city they're not traveling to. Noted, categorized, filed, returned to the bags. She didn't think about him again for a week, or she told herself that. The first week of roof work she did entirely alone, the smaller leaks sealed with the damaged tarps and the rusted nails from Barbara's back room. The 2 large gaps above the kitchen wing were going to require more material and more structural understanding than she currently had access to. Then Gary Young appeared. 14 years old. A bicycle that expressed its repair history in its construction. He stopped at the end of the drive on a Tuesday afternoon and looked at Katie, on the roof, with the expression of someone who has formed opinions. "You're going to get that wrong," he said. She looked down at him from 20 feet up. "I've already done half of it. That's what I mean." She came down the ladder, because that conversation was not one she was going to conduct from a roofline. She stood in the dead grass of the yard and looked at this 14-year-old with his second-hand bicycle and his frank assessment, and she felt the specific irritation of someone who suspects the other person might be correct. He knew the roof because Margaret had taught him. 2 winters of coming out after school to do what Margaret's knees, and then her lungs, and then her general reserves no longer permitted. His phone never stopped ringing. He had learned the particular failure points of this specific structure, absorption that comes from someone patient teaching you something real. He showed her the section above the back bedroom that looked repaired, but wasn't. Just covered, and the covering had been doing that job for 6 years, and was done. He showed her where the rafters had been sistered incorrectly at some earlier point, an old repair that had addressed the visible problem without touching the underlying cause. He showed her where she could work safely, and how to read the difference from a distance. He worked until noon without stopping. Said what needed saying and nothing extra. When he climbed down, she asked, "How did you know Margaret?" He was quiet for a moment, considering the question, not the answer. "She tutored me," he said. "Wednesdays, 2 years. Math mostly. I was falling behind and she heard about it somehow. She never charged anything. Said she had the time and I had the need, and those two things worked out to an obvious answer. He picked up his bike. She was like that. She started to let him go. Gary, he stopped. Did she ever mention someone named Donald Thomas? The change in his face was small, but it was there. The specific flattening that happens when a name arrives, carrying more weight than the speaker fully knows. Everyone in Harlan knows who he is, he said. He's the kind of person you know about before you understand why. He looked at her steadily. Margaret said once that some people mistake patience for weakness. She said that was a mistake she was glad certain people kept making. He pedaled away. Katie stood in the yard and let that sit for a while. Then she went back up the ladder, the second time she saw Timothy Clark. She was loading a roll of damaged tarp into the truck bed alone and losing. The roll weighed more than the operation could accommodate with only two of her arms. He appeared beside her without sound, took the other end, waited for her grip, between them, 45 seconds. Thanks, she said. He nodded, walked back into the store. That was the entire exchange. Except that 4 days later he was on her roof, holding the braceboard she'd been trying to secure with 3 hands she didn't have, at exactly the angle that made the whole repair achievable. He stayed 3 hours, fixed 2 structural problems she hadn't known how to approach, left before dark without saying goodbye. She told herself she wasn't going to think about why. She thought about it anyway. He came back on Thursday, then the following Tuesday, always in the morning, always with a thermos of coffee and a bag of tools she didn't own. Always working on whichever problem was most structurally urgent, as if he'd spent his evenings off-site, conducting a mental survey of the farm's priorities. By the 4th visit, she had stopped being surprised. By the 7th, she asked directly. They were working on the south wall. She was handing him boards. He was fitting them. Barbara only asked you to come once. Yes, so why do you keep coming? A pause. The length of it was consideration, not discomfort. Margaret Holt delivered me, he said, still looking at the board he was setting. Winter 2001. Roads were frozen solid. My mother would have died. Both of us, probably. He fit the board and checked it. I've known that my whole life. But there was never anyone to pay it back to. She waited. Debts don't expire just because the person does. She didn't say anything, because what words would have been correct? She handed him the next board, and he fitted it without looking. And they worked in silence for another hour, and the wall, when they finished, was the most solid thing on the property. April turned the grass green at the tips, tentatively not committing to the full declaration yet. The days got longer. The rhythm of repair became something her body knew, and she started reading the house's structural needs the way she'd learned to read bus schedules in Lincoln and shelter intake procedures in Cheyenne. Fluently and without conscious effort, she drove to Richard's cabin on a Tuesday morning in late April, with the journal and a page of questions she'd written out by hand and then not consulted again because she knew them well enough. He told her about the Homestead Clause over coffee, the Homestead Act of 1862, the trust addendum attached to certain early 20th century claims, written directly into the original federal filing. Any transfer of the land outside the direct bloodline required federal review and approval. Not county approval, federal, a different jurisdiction entirely, one that Calvin Thomas's influence could not reach. The Theodore transfer in 1998, Richard said. The strip of land he sold Thomas for $200, the strip that controls your access road. Under this clause, that transfer was void the day it was signed. It was never legally Thomas's. Everything he's built using that access in 30 years. He's built on nothing, Katie said. He's built on what everyone believed was solid because nobody checked the federal filing. Nobody had reason to check a 100-year-old homestead claim on land that had never changed hands. He looked at her steadily until someone had every reason to. When did Margaret find out? Early 1990s. She consulted a lawyer in Billings, privately, someone she'd trusted for years. The lawyer confirmed what she suspected. And then Margaret put these papers in this trunk and told me to hold them, and told me to tell no one. Not even to imply she knew. He folded his hands on the table. Because she wanted Thomas to spend 30 more years building on that foundation. She wanted the structure to be as large and as complete as possible before anyone pulled it. Katie looked at the oilcloth bundle. She couldn't have known she'd have 30 more years. She had 14 from that point. She died in 2012. His voice was even. But she prepared as if the time might be longer. She made the best plan she could and she executed it without knowing whether she'd live to see it matter. A pause. I think she understood that possibility. I think she made her peace with it. The cottonwoods along the river outside the window had put out their first leaves, small and pale green, the tentative green of something that wasn't sure yet how much trust to extend to spring. She didn't know Olivia had died, Katie said. No. She went to her grave believing Olivia might still come back, that whoever came might be Olivia herself. Something tightened in Katie's chest and released, the way things do when a truth drops into its permanent position. Then I'll do what Olivia would have done, she said, if she'd made it back. Richard looked at her for a long moment. That's exactly what I needed to hear, he said. Now let me show you everything. He opened the trunk. All the way this time. She spent 3 hours at that table going through 30 years of accumulated documentation. His notes, Margaret's notes, the cross-referenced property records, the photographs taken through windows, the cassette tapes in their labeled cases. By the time she drove home, the late afternoon had gone golden, and her hands were smudged with the particular ink of old paper, and she understood, for the first time, with something like completeness, what two old people had been building in parallel across 30 years. Not a complaint, not an accusation, not even a case. Exactly, a record, complete, continuous, cross-referenced and patient. The kind of record that has its own gravity when enough of it accumulates in one place. She was going to add to it. She was going to be the weight that finally tipped it. She went home and started a notebook, wrote the date at the top of the first page, then the description of Donald Thomas's truck, make and model and color, because she had watched it carefully when he'd been at the farm and she was learning to watch carefully now. It was a habit Margaret had practiced for 30 years. It was the least she could do to begin. Donald Thomas came to see her in October. She heard the truck from the roof. Too new for this road, too quiet for the dust it raised. She came down the ladder and was in the yard before he got out, which gave her the positional advantage of standing with both feet on the ground and a clear sightline to the gate. Small thing. But she had started paying attention to small advantages. He looked at the porch first. At the new post she and Timothy had installed in August, the roof line above it restored to horizontal. At the repairs that had accumulated over 6 months of work, something moved across his face that he controlled before it could settle into an expression she could read. You fixed the porch. I had help. The Clark boy, he's 23. I know how old he is. He walked toward her, at the pace of a man who had never felt the need to hurry, because the things he wanted had generally waited. He was 58 years old, broad in the shoulders, gray at the temples in a way that looked considered. He carried himself with the ease of someone who had spent 30 years operating, without encountering anyone willing to hold their ground. I'll make you a fair offer, Miss Holt. Given what you've put into the place, she waited, 45,000, cash. You walk away clean, no liens, no complications. She looked at him, the photograph, the reflection in the window glass behind her mother, 1997. A younger face, darker hair, but the same jaw, the same quality of stillness that isn't stillness at all, but the patience of a person who has already decided the outcome and is waiting for reality to comply. He had been 37 years old in that photograph. Olivia had been 17. He had been standing on the road watching her have her picture taken, and not knowing that the woman who loved her was on the other side of that glass with a camera. The property isn't for sale, she said. Everything is for sale. He held the offer without warmth or hostility, just the functional confidence of a sentence that had worked many times before. You just don't know your price yet. You're young. This land is isolated. You'll burn through whatever you found in that house by spring. And then what? Then I figure out what comes next. The way my great-great-grandmother did. The smile retreated. Something else moved in behind it. The flicker of a person who has heard a familiar cadence from an unexpected direction. Margaret was a stubborn woman who turned down 3 serious offers and died alone, in a house that was falling in around her, he said. She died in her own house. Katie kept her voice level, kept her hands still at her sides. There's a difference between those two things that you've never been willing to understand. His jaw tightened. One beat of real reaction before the control came back. You have whatever time you have to make this work, he said. When it doesn't, I'll be here. Then don't go too far. He looked at her for a long moment. Not angry, calculating. The look of someone adding up a sum that isn't coming out the way he expected. Your great-great-grandmother used to say the same thing, he said, and turned and walked back to his truck. Stubborn. Just like her. We'll see how that works out. He drove off. The dust settled back to the road. Katie went inside and wrote the date in her notebook, the figure he'd offered, the exact phrases he'd used. Then she opened Margaret's journal and started reading it again from the first page. This time she knew his face. This time every entry landed differently, with the specific weight of recognition. The 1985 visit, the 1989 return with a higher number, and the 11 minutes he'd sat in the drive without speaking. The 1992 Ashby property. The 1996 inquiries about Theodore Holt's land holdings at the county assessor's office, made 2 years before he came to Theodore's door with a notary and a stack of papers, and a voice calibrated to sound like a formality. And the entries about Olivia, written small, written close. She came home crying, won't say what happened. She says she has evidence. She's gone. Katie sat at the kitchen table with the journal open and her new notebook open beside it and thought about her mother at 17. Carrying something too heavy for one person. Trying to do what needed doing in a county where every official channel was owned by the family she was trying to stop. Running not because she gave up, but because staying would have meant losing everything, including the evidence, including herself, and she had understood that the moment she survived was the moment she preserved the possibility of a later moment. She had preserved it. She had not lived to see it, but she had preserved it. Katie closed both notebooks, stacked them on the shelf above the kitchen table where she could reach them easily, banked the wood stove for the night. Outside, the October dark came down over 80 acres of Montana grassland. The stars appeared in the density they always did here, without ceremony, she thought. Margaret kept this up for 30 years, she thought. I can keep it up for however long it takes. She went to bed. She would need the sleep. There was still so much to build. Barbara didn't finish the sentence, which turned out to be its own kind of sentence. She stood in that clinic hallway with her hat in both hands and her eyes fixed on the exam room door, and she said, I asked him to come once. Once. Everything after that and then she stopped. And the stopping was the indictment. The stopping said everything the words were too controlled to say out loud. That she knew, that she had known for weeks, that Timothy was driving out to the Holt property on his own time for his own reasons. And she had let herself believe the fiction that she'd sent him because the fiction was tidier than the truth. The truth being that her nephew had made a choice she hadn't authorized. The truth being that he'd gotten hurt making it. Katie opened her mouth. Barbara's hand came up. Not aggressive. Not even directed at Katie specifically. Just the gesture of a person who has decided the conversation is complete and will not be reopened today. Stay away from him while he heals, Barbara said. That's all I'm asking. She walked out. Katie sat back down in the plastic chair and looked at her wrapped knuckles and thought, okay, all right, this is what it costs. This is the specific shape of what it costs when you let people get close to something that has a target on it. She had known this, theoretically. She had grown up in a system specifically designed to teach children that connection was a variable, that people who mattered to you were a liability your circumstances could always exploit. She had thought, arriving in Harlan, arriving at the farm, that this time was different, because this time she was the one holding something worth fighting for, instead of being the thing someone else was fighting over. She had been wrong about what different meant. Different didn't mean safe. It meant the danger came from a new direction. Timothy texted once from his mother's house 2 days later. I'm okay, don't worry, I'll be back when I can. She read it 4 times and wrote back, okay, take your time. Then she put her phone face down on the kitchen table and didn't pick it up again for 6 hours. The building inspector's notice arrived 3 days after that. A county deputy she'd never seen before came up the drive in an official vehicle and handed her the envelope, without making eye contact, which told her everything she needed to know about whether he was comfortable with his errand. The notice cited the barn structure as a public safety violation. 30 days to demolish at her own expense, or the county would contract the demolition and bill her for the privilege. She looked up the inspector's name that afternoon at the library. He had attended a company barbecue at the Thomas Ranch 18 months earlier. His name appeared in the caption of a photograph on the County Agricultural Board's social media page, standing next to Donald Thomas, both of them holding plates. Both of them smiling with the ease of men who understood themselves to be on the same side of things and had never had reason to question that positioning. She printed the photograph, added it to the folder she'd started keeping in the cabinet under the kitchen sink, because that was what you did. When you couldn't fight the move directly, you documented it. You added it to the record. You trusted that records, built with enough patience over enough time, had a weight that individual incidents didn't possess on their own. She was learning to think like Margaret, It was taking. The diner closed on a Friday. Sharon Ramirez called her the Thursday night before, her voice doing something complicated that wasn't quite crying, and wasn't quite not crying. The building had been sold. The new rent was more than twice what she'd been paying. She'd tried every arrangement she could imagine, and there was no version of the numbers that worked. "I'm sorry, honey," Sharon said. "I can't keep you on. I can barely keep the lights on through the weekend." Katie told her it was fine. It wasn't fine, but it was also not Sharon's fault, and Sharon, knowing it wasn't fine, wouldn't change anything except Sharon's state of mind, which was already doing enough difficult things without guilt added to the pile. The building had been sold to a holding company incorporated in Billings. She found the registration that same Thursday night at the county recorder's online database. The registered agent was a name she didn't recognize, but the address of record for the holding company was a post office box in Harlan County. And that same post office box appeared in 3 other property documents she'd located during her research into the Thomas family's land holdings over the previous 2 months. She added that to the folder under the kitchen sink. What she had now was no job, no income, 22 days remaining before her original 90-day window would have expired if she hadn't cleared the taxes, and a growing file of documented pressure that she couldn't yet act on because the documentation was evidence of a pattern. And patterns required time to establish their full shape. She had cleared the taxes. She had 6 weeks of remote administrative work keeping her in groceries and gasoline. She had the farm, which was hers legally and could not be taken back. But she was alone in a way she hadn't been since March. No Timothy. No Barbara. No Sharon, just a house she was still repairing, a journal she'd read 4 times, a folder under the kitchen sink, and Richard Miller 6 miles east with a trunk full of 30 years of careful preparation. She drove to Richard's cabin the following morning. He was not surprised by any of it. She'd noticed this about him, that nothing she brought him seemed to exceed his capacity for calm reception. Not because he was indifferent, because he had been expecting, at some level, exactly this sequence. He had watched Donald Thomas work for 26 years. The playbook was legible to him the way a familiar text is legible, not word by word, but in patterns, in structures, in the grammar of how a certain kind of pressure gets applied to certain kinds of situations. "He's compressing," Richard said. "He wants you financially stressed and socially isolated. If you're desperate enough, you'll take a number. Any number. What number is he going to offer? He'll start at 5, maybe 6,000. He'll go higher if you push back. He won't go as high as the land is actually worth because he doesn't need to. He knows your position." "What he doesn't know," she said, "is mine." She had meant it to come out more resolved than it did. It came out with a slight tentativeness that was honest, and Richard was the kind of person who valued honesty over the performance of confidence. "No," he agreed. "He doesn't know yours, and that asymmetry is the most important thing in this situation right now." He got up and poured more coffee and set hers closer to her. "He's done this to people who had less than you have. They had the land and the will to keep it and not much else. You have the land, the will, and 30 years of someone else's preparation that he has no idea exists. I still need income, yes, you do." He sat back down. "Let me think about that." What he came back with 2 days later was a contact at a ranching operation 60 miles north that needed seasonal administrative work done remotely. Invoicing and record keeping. The kind of work that could be done from the farm on the second-hand laptop she'd bought in Billings for $43. The pay was not generous. It was enough to maintain forward motion without having to choose between groceries and gasoline. She said yes before he finished describing it. She kept the remote work through November. She kept the folder under the kitchen sink. She kept the new notebook on the shelf above the kitchen table where Margaret's journal lived, adding entries the way Margaret had added them, dated, specific, without editorializing. She drove out to Richard's cabin twice a week, and they worked through the trunk's contents systematically, building the cross-referenced understanding of what they had and what gaps remained and what would be needed to fill them. It was in early November, going through a section of Richard's files she hadn't reached before, that she found the Wyoming folder. The Wyoming folder was thinner than the Harlan County materials, more tentative. Richard had described it as a pattern he'd identified, but hadn't been able to confirm, because everything in it involved another county in another state, and his jurisdiction had never extended that far. 9 workers' compensation claims filed by employees of Curtis Thomas's operation in Campbell County, Wyoming. Curtis was Donald's older brother. His ranching operation was structured separately. Different corporate entities, different county, different state, maintained at a careful distance from the Harlan County holdings. Of those 9 claims, 7 had involved fatalities. A tractor rollover, 2 stable fires in different years, a drowning in a stock tank, falls. In the span of 15 years, 7 out of 9 was a number that asked questions even if you'd never worked in law enforcement. Richard had spent 26 years in it, and the number asked him very specific questions that he hadn't had the reach or the resources to answer alone. "Has anyone looked at this?" she said. Campbell County closed each case within the first week. No follow-up. He looked at the folder. The sheriff over there until 2018 was named Dale Purvis. He retired to a property in Montana that he couldn't have purchased on a county sheriff's salary. A pause. "I've had this for 4 years. I didn't know what to do with it alone." She looked at the 7 names, each one with a date, each one with a brief case summary, each one followed by case closed, accidental determination. She thought about 7 families, 7 sets of people told it was an accident and then told there was nothing further to investigate. 7 cases that had been closed within 7 days by a county official who later retired to a property his legitimate income couldn't explain. She thought about Olivia at 17 with her folder and her recording, trying to do the right thing in a county where the official responsible for doing the right thing was owned by the person she was trying to stop. The pattern was not limited to Harlan County. It was not limited to Montana. It was a methodology refined over decades, applied wherever the Thomas family operated, and it had been working without interruption for 15 years in Wyoming. Because nobody had connected the Wyoming incidents to the Harlan County history, and nobody had connected either of those to the federal question of the Homestead Trust Clause. "Until now, we need someone to connect it," she said. "We need 3 things," Richard said. "We need someone who can speak to the Wyoming incidents from first-hand knowledge. We need the federal homestead documentation presented in a venue that has jurisdiction over the land question. And we need enough of the Harlan County pattern documented and witnessed to establish that what happened to Olivia in 1998 was not an isolated incident, but part of a deliberate and ongoing practice. The third one we're close to having. The second one we have." He looked at her. "The first one is what we're missing." She drove home in the early dark of a November evening thinking about the shape of what was missing. A person with direct knowledge of the Wyoming incidents. Someone who had been there, or close to there, or had spent years trying to connect the same dots from the inside. She didn't know yet that the answer was going to drive itself up her road on Christmas Eve in a Honda Civic with 2 children in the back seat. And a woman had been running for 3 years with exactly that knowledge folded into the bottom of a bag under her kids' spare clothes. She didn't know yet that the blizzard was going to bring her what she needed. But that was still 6 weeks away. And 6 weeks in November and December in Montana was its own kind of endurance. She banked the wood stove. She ate dinner. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top and then, below it, the names from Richard's Wyoming folder, all 7 of them. Because they deserved to be in her record, too. Because someone should be marking the fact that they had existed and that their deaths had been called accidents and then abandoned. She wrote until her hand hurt. Then she closed the notebook and went to bed. The fire attempt happened on a Tuesday night, in the first week of November, when the temperature had dropped to 10 below and the snow on the ground had crusted to something that crunched like broken glass underfoot at every step. Katie had been at the kitchen table, going through a section of property records when she heard the sound from the direction of the barn. Not loud, not the sound of someone who wanted to be heard. The sound of very careful movement, the kind of care that means precision matters, that something is being applied deliberately to a surface. She was at the kitchen window. Before she'd consciously decided to move there, the figure was at the barn's south wall, moving slowly along the base of it, covering the same ground twice, with a specific and methodical attention that was not the attention of someone who had stumbled onto the property. A flashlight in one hand. Something else in the other, heavy, carried at the end of his arm like a full container. The smell reached her through the poorly fitted window frame before she'd finished processing what she was seeing. Gasoline. The next 30 seconds had the quality of time that moves differently under specific conditions. Not slow, just extremely clear, the way everything becomes clear when the stakes are real and the margin is narrow and there is no time to deliberate. She went to the corner of the kitchen, Margaret's shotgun. A Stevens 12 gauge from 1962. kept there because it had always been kept there, in the corner beside the woodpile, where a person reaching for it in the dark would find it without needing light. She had loaded it for the first time 10 days earlier, after watching a tutorial twice and then practicing the motion without shells until it was mechanical. Not because she'd known this was coming, because she was learning to prepare for things before she needed to rather than after. 2 shells. The action closed. She went out the back door. No boots. The snow entered her awareness as a fact, but not as a priority. The cold was a knife at every breath, and the snow under her bare feet was a detail she was filing for later consideration, and later consideration would have to wait. She came around the corner of the barn. He had the lighter out. Silva catching the moonlight. Chrome Zippo. The kind that lasted decades if you maintained it. His thumb on the wheel. She racked the slide. The sound of a shotgun action in cold night air is one of those sounds that doesn't need translation. It communicates its meaning directly to the nervous system, bypassing language entirely. He froze. Drop it. The lighter hit the snow. The small flame he'd started, already struggling in the wind, died. He turned slowly. Ski mask. Eyes visible, white and wide. The eyes of a person who had arrived confident about this errand and was now conducting a rapid revision of his assessment of how it was going to end. "Pick it up," Katie said. "Throw it to me." "Then run." He hesitated. She looked at him over the barrel and understood, in a way she hoped translated through whatever of her face he could see in the dark, that she was not performing any part of this moment. She was a 19-year-old woman who had slept in a truck in Montana in March and had walked into an auction with $7. And had chosen this piece of ground, and everything it represented, and there was no version of tonight where she backed away from the edge of it. He picked up the lighter, threw it underhand. She caught it. He ran, stumbled in the deep snow, found his footing, disappeared across the field toward whatever vehicle he'd left at the County Road. The sound of an engine starting, faint and distant, then gone. She stood in the snow with her feet going numb, and the lighter in one hand and the shotgun in the other, and she let him go. Because she had something better than the satisfaction of stopping him. She had evidence. She brought it inside and stood at the kitchen table and held it under the light Chrome Zippo. Good condition. The kind of lighter that gets maintained because the person who carries it paid attention to small things. Engraved on the side in the looping script of a cattle brand. Crane Farm Co., the name from the diner building registration. The holding company that appeared in 3 separate Thomas property documents. The post office box in Harlan County, the entity that had purchased the building Sharon, had rented and then raised the rent until she couldn't breathe. This lighter, dropped in the snow outside her barn by a man with a can of gasoline, was not just evidence of an arson attempt. It was a thread connecting the person who had tried to burn down her barn to the entity that had cost Sharon her business, and both of those to the man who had stood in her yard in October and offered her $45,000 to disappear. She put the lighter in a Ziploc bag from the kitchen drawer, put the bag in the metal box from the hiding place, put the metal box back in the floor cabinet where she kept things that needed to be kept. Then she went to bed, didn't sleep, but went to bed. She drove to Richard's cabin before sunrise and laid the lighter in the bag on his table. He turned it over, held it to the window light. "Set it down, the entity name," she said. "Crane Farm Co. It's in 3 of the documents we found for his holdings. The diner building, 2 others. I know the name." His voice had the particular careful quality it got when something fit a slot he'd been holding empty. He's used it as a shell since the early 2000s. Purchases he didn't want directly attached to Thomas Land Holdings as the named entity. He looked at the lighter. The man who carried this is not Thomas himself. He hired this out. He'll deny knowing the person, but the lighter connects the hiring to the entity. The lighter connects the entity to the location and the act. Combined with the timeline of his visits and his offers, and the building purchase and the barn inspection, he picked it up again. It's a thread, and threads, pulled carefully enough, unravel things. He set it back down on the table. "There's something else," he said. He went to the trunk. Not for the oilcloth bundle, for a folder she hadn't seen before, from the back of the second row, thicker than its neighbors. He set it on the table and opened it. Property records, but from Wyoming. Campbell County, Sheridan County. Workers' compensation filings, insurance documents, and on one of the insurance documents, in the co-insured party field, a name she recognized. Crane Farm Co. Stephanie would find this thread 3 weeks later, sitting at Richard's kitchen table with her own notebooks open. She would look up from the Campbell County document and look at Katie and say, "That's the same entity name." and the room would go very quiet with the specific quality of pieces connecting across a distance that had seemed, until that moment, too great to bridge. But that was 3 weeks later. 6 weeks before Christmas. And first there was the blizzard to get through. The weather service had been discussing the incoming storm for a week. 20 inches possible, they said, which in Montana meant you planned for 30 and counted yourself fortunate if it landed at 15. Katie had laid in firewood until the stack against the east wall of the house was as high as she could reach. She had filled every container she owned with water. She had checked the wood stove twice and the roof patches 3 times, and she was, by any reasonable measure, as prepared as a person alone on an 80-acre farm with limited resources could be, which was the story of everything, lately. Prepared within the limits of what prepared was possible to be. She was at the kitchen table at 11 on the night of December 24th, with Margaret's journal open and her own notebook beside it when the headlights appeared at the end of the drive. Moving wrong. Too fast for the conditions. Swinging wide on the curve, where the road bent north before straightening toward the house. The kind of swing that meant the driver either didn't know the road, or had lost the road, or was past the point where they had enough control to stay on it, regardless of knowing it. She watched through the kitchen window as the car lost the surface entirely on the ice and came to a stop in the shallow ditch at the property line. Rear wheels throwing snow in a useless spray. Honda Civic. Exactly the wrong vehicle for this road in these conditions. The kind of car a person drives when they're traveling toward something that matters more than the logistics of the journey and has stopped thinking about the logistics. She put on every layer she owned, took the lantern from the windowsill where she'd started keeping it in December, lit it, and went out into weather that had opinions. The wind expressed those opinions continuously and at volume. She made the 100 yards to the car by leaning into it and refusing to stop, which was the only technique available. The lantern threw a circle of light that the blowing snow ate before it could do much. But it was better than nothing, and nothing was the only alternative. She knocked on the driver's window. The face that appeared on the other side of the glass was pale with cold and dark-eyed and frightened in the specific way of a person who has used up their margin of error and is aware of it. The window went down 2 inches. "My children," the voice was a woman's. Tight with cold and something else, the particular tightness of someone holding themselves together by force of will. "Please, my children are in the back seat." A boy of 9, maybe 10, pressed against the far door with his arms around a smaller figure. A girl, 5 or 6 years old. The 2 of them under a single blanket that was not designed for this temperature or this duration of exposure. The boy was awake and watching with the focused attention of a child who has learned that watching carefully is useful. The girl was not moving. Her lips had taken on a color that Katie recognized. Blue at the center, fading to gray at the edges. A color that meant she needed to be warmer inside the next few minutes, not the next half hour. Caddy got the door open, got the woman standing, got her moving toward the house, then went back for the children. She carried the girl, who was small enough and cold enough that she didn't protest being carried, didn't respond much to anything, which was the part that meant moving faster than the snow, and the wind wanted to allow. The boy walked beside her with her hand on his shoulder, steady and quiet in a way that seemed older than his age. She got them inside. She got the door closed on the blizzard, which had been making arguments about this from the beginning, and was not finished making them even after the door was shut. What followed was 2 hours of the most focused work she'd done since the morning she'd gone down the barn stairs into the underground room. She had read Margaret's entries about hypothermia, not as research, just as part of reading everything, because everything in the journal had seemed worth understanding, including the sections where Margaret described her years as a county midwife, the difficult births and the agricultural accidents, and the particular challenges of treating people in Montana winters, when the nearest hospital was an hour away on a good road. Do not rewarm too fast. The cold blood returning to the heart too quickly can stop it. You use body heat because it is slower than any external source, and slower is what keeps people alive. She got the woman out of her wet outer layers, got her into dry things from the back room closet, got her into the bed with the girl held against her bare skin under 3 layers of blanket. Skin to skin, the oldest and most reliable method. She made broth from a can and made the woman drink it before she felt ready to, which required persistence. She heated water and sealed it in a jar and placed it near the girl's feet. She talked while she worked. Not comfort talk. Information. Here is what we're doing and here is why. Because a person in crisis is better served by understanding than by reassurance, and this woman had the look of someone who had been making hard decisions for long enough to prefer information to sentiment. The boy sat by the wood stove and watched everything and said nothing. His name was Finn. He told her this when she asked, in a voice that was steady in the specific way of a child who has learned to be steady because the people around him needed someone to be. His sister's name was Hazel. Around 4 in the morning, Hazel made a sound. Small, not quite a cry, but the woman heard it from the edge of sleep and came fully awake and pulled the girl closer. And the sound the woman made then was also small, not quite a cry, the sound of a body processing relief that the mind is still catching up to. "She's okay," Katie said. "She's going to be okay." The woman held her daughter and didn't say anything for a long time. In the morning, after Finn and Hazel had eaten and fallen asleep on the couch under a pile of blankets and quilts from the back room, the woman sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug and looked at Katie with the eyes of someone who has used up their reserves of pretending. Her name was Stephanie Harris, 36 years old. She had been driving from Idaho toward a job in North Dakota, she said. But that was the surface of it, the practical explanation, and they both understood from the quality of the silence that followed it that the surface was not the whole story. "Where were you actually going?" Katie said. Stephanie looked at her mug. "Bismarck, FBI field office. I have materials I've been trying to get to someone with federal jurisdiction for 8 months. A pause. I kept going to state and county offices and kept getting told there was nothing actionable, or the cases were closed, or the incidents happened in another jurisdiction. I finally got an email response from an agent in Bismarck who told me to come in person. What materials?" Stephanie set the mug down, looked at the window where the storm was still pressing its case against the glass. "My husband died in 2014, she said. On a ranch in Campbell County, Wyoming. They called it an accident. A fire in the bunkhouse, bad wiring. He was the only one who didn't get out. No one else was hurt." She looked at Katie. "The ranch belonged to Curtis Thomas, Donald Thomas's older brother." The kitchen went very quiet. "I kept a notebook after Daniel died," Stephanie continued. "I started writing down everything I could find. Every name connected to the Thomas family operations, every incident. Every man who died in a way that got called accidental and then stopped being looked at. I worked as a courthouse filing clerk in Campbell County for 2 years after Daniel died. People don't pay attention to the person doing the filing." A pause. "I have 9 names, 15 years. Not one of them was investigated past the first week. 9 names, the exact number in Richard's Wyoming folder." Katie looked at this woman who had been running for 3 years, with that knowledge in the bottom of her bag, trying to reach a jurisdiction that couldn't be owned by the family she was trying to stop, and who had slid off the road in a Montana blizzard, and ended up at the one farm in Harlan County, where someone was sitting up past midnight reading a journal full of 30 years of the same kind of careful documentation. "Don't go to Bismarck," Katie said. Stephanie looked at her. "Stay here, you and your kids. As long as you need to." She held her gaze. "There's a man 6 miles east of here. He was sheriff of this county for 26 years. He has a trunk full of documents going back to 1985 that your notebooks are the missing piece of." She waited. "He's been waiting for someone to bring him the rest of the picture." Stephanie was quiet for a long time. Outside, the blizzard was making its arguments against every surface of the house simultaneously. The wood stove ticked steadily. Hazel made a small sound in her sleep from the other room and was quiet again. "I've been driving for 3 years, Stephanie said finally, trying to find somewhere that wasn't theirs. "This place isn't theirs," Katie said. "I paid $7 for it and it's mine, and they've been trying to get it back since March and they haven't managed it yet." Something shifted in Stephanie's face. The specific shift of a person who has been holding tension in place for so long that releasing any part of it is a physical event. "Okay," she said quietly. Just that, Katie got up and added wood to the stove. The storm had begun to ease slightly, the quality of the sound against the windows changing from argument to statement to something that was almost conversation. She thought about the lantern she'd put in the window in December, the first week after she'd understood that the road out front was dark in a way that people coming from the north didn't anticipate. A light in a window was the most basic possible offer. Someone is here. You're not lost. There is a place. She hadn't planned for this, but she had left the light on. And the light had done what lights do. They drove out to Richard's cabin 2 days after Christmas. Stephanie sat in the passenger seat, with her 3 composition notebooks on her lap, and the particular composure of someone who has been running so long that sitting still requires the same kind of effort that running used to. Finn was in the back seat looking out the window at the snow-covered fields, with the focused attention he brought to everything. Hazel was asleep against his shoulder. Richard was on the porch. Of course he was. He watched them get out of the truck and he stood up from the rocking chair and waited, which was not something he always did when Katie arrived alone. Standing was a different reception. Standing was for something that had changed the situation. Katie introduced them at the bottom of the porch steps. She told him who Stephanie was. She told him what was in the notebooks. She watched his face while she talked, and his face stayed with the controlled stillness it always maintained. But his hands, which he'd put in his jacket pockets when he stood up, tightened slightly at what she said about the 9 names. "Come in," he said. "All of you. Inside." Finn sat at the edge of the room with Hazel on his lap, quiet and watching with the self-contained patience of a child who has learned to take up exactly the space he's given and no more. Stephanie set her notebooks on the table. Richard sat down across from them and opened the first one. He read all 3 without stopping, an hour and 20 minutes. His right hand stayed on the table beside the notebooks, and Katie watched his knuckles go pale incrementally as he moved through the pages. When he finished, he set the last notebook down and looked at Stephanie. "This is what I didn't have," he said. "I had the Wyoming deaths as a pattern. I didn't have the connections between the incidents. The contractor names that appear in multiple files. The insurance adjusters who show up in 3 separate cases across 2 incidents. The county official who appears in capacities that don't have an obvious explanation." Stephanie looked at the notebooks. "I worked at that courthouse for 2 years. Nobody pays attention to the person doing the filing. They leave things on the copier. They have conversations in front of you because you're furniture to them. How long have you been carrying this alone?" 3 years. A pause. "Daniel always said I was too detail-oriented, that I saw connections that weren't there." She met Richard's eyes. "Turns out that was the most useful thing about me." Richard was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "What's useful is that you kept going for 3 years with no reason to believe it would lead anywhere." He closed the top notebook. "Both things are necessary. The second is rarer." He got up, went to the trunk, came back with the Wyoming folder Katie had found 6 weeks earlier, and set it on the table beside Stephanie's notebooks. Stephanie looked at it, then looked at Richard. "You already had this. I had the pattern without the connections. You have the connections without the full Harlan County context." He looked at them both. "Together, it's something different from either piece alone." Stephanie opened the folder. She was cross-referencing dates against her notebook entries when she stopped. Set her pen down. "The holding company name," she said. "Crane Farm Co." She pointed to a line in the Campbell County insurance document. "It's listed here as a co-insured party on the policy that covered the bunkhouse fire. The one where Daniel died." She looked at Katie. "That's the same entity name as your lighter." The room went quiet with the specific quality of things connecting across a distance that had seemed, until that moment, unbridgeable. Because if the entity named on the lighter found in the snow outside Katie's barn was co-insured on the Wyoming policy that covered a fatal fire in Campbell County, this was not 2 parallel patterns. This was one pattern operating across state lines, across decades, across the gap between a barn in Montana and a bunkhouse in Wyoming. And the thread connecting them had been sitting in a Ziploc bag in a metal box under Katie's kitchen floor for 6 weeks, waiting for someone to bring the other end of it into the same room. Richard got up and went to his desk and came back with a legal pad. He wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. He mapped the connections, the jurisdictional questions in the margins, the sequence in which things needed to move to make the structure hold under scrutiny. 3 filings, he said when he was done, in 3 different places, so that no single entity can suppress all of them simultaneously. He laid it out. The federal civil suit challenging the 1998 Theodore Holt land transfer under the Homestead Trust Clause, filed in the Federal District Court in Montana, where Calvin Thomas's residual influence had no reach. The complaint to the Montana Attorney General regarding the conduct of the former sheriff in 1998, specifically the suppression of Olivia's evidence file, filed with Stephanie's documentation of the cross-state entity connection to establish a pattern of institutional interference rather than an isolated incident. And the third filing, the FBI field office in Salt Lake City, which had jurisdiction over both Montana and Wyoming, containing Stephanie's notebooks and Rich's files and the sworn statements they were going to spend the next 4 weeks collecting. Salt Lake City, Stephanie said, regional office, jurisdiction over both states. The agent who responded to your email was from Bismarck, which is the North Dakota office. Salt Lake is the right venue for what we're bringing them. Stephanie looked at her notebooks on the table. 3 years of running with those notebooks at the bottom of a bag. 3 states. Every county office telling her the same version of the same thing. Closed, not actionable, different jurisdiction, not ours. How long? Katie said. The civil filing will move fastest. The Homestead Clause is unambiguous federal law, and the district will have to address it. The AG complaint will move at the speed of bureaucratic process, which is slow but doesn't stop. The FBI packet, he paused. That depends on who opens it, and if the right person doesn't open it, then we find the right person. We document the attempt and we find another way in. That's what the process is for. He looked at both of them. This is not fast. I want you to understand that before we begin. What we're building is solid, but solid things still take time to move through systems. Katie thought about Margaret writing in her journal in 1985, then 1989, then 1992. 30 years of the same methodical work, no guarantee of outcome, no promise that the moment would arrive. I've been waiting my whole life, she said. I have some patience left. Richard looked at her, and in his face was something she hadn't seen there before. Not surprise. Recognition. The particular recognition of a man who has been keeping faith with a thing for 20 years and has just heard, from an unexpected direction, the echo of the person he was keeping faith for. He picked up his pen. Then let's get to work, he said. They started that afternoon. The 4 weeks between Christmas and the filing date moved with the weight of time that has somewhere specific to go and has been building toward it for a long time. Not slowly, not quickly, with the specific momentum of accumulated intention. And outside the cabin windows, across 6 miles of Montana winter road, the lantern burned in the farmhouse window through every night of those 4 weeks. Visible from the ridge. A fixed point in the dark, the most basic possible signal. Someone is here, the light is on, you are not as lost as you thought you were. They filed on a Tuesday morning, in February, when the temperature had climbed above zero for the first time in 3 weeks, and the sky over Billings was the particular hard blue of a winter that is considering, without committing to, the possibility of ending. Richard drove. He wore his 1989 wool suit, which still fit him because he was a man who had not allowed himself to become a different size than he'd been at his most functional. And Katie understood now that this was not vanity but a form of discipline, the same discipline that had kept the trunk current and the legal knowledge maintained, and the readiness intact across 16 years of a retirement that most people would have used to put all of it down. Katie wore the dark green dress Sharon had found at a thrift store in Billings and driven an hour to bring her. Her hair was pulled back, her hands were steady. 3 filings, 3 separate offices, 3 separate hours of the morning, each one deliberate, each one documented, each one handed over with materials organized in the way that Richard, who had spent 26 years of producing documentation meant to hold up under scrutiny, knew how to organize things. The federal district courthouse first. The civil suit challenging the 1998 Theodore Holt land transfer under the Homestead Trust Clause. The clerk took the packet and gave Katie a filing receipt and said the case would be assigned within 10 business days. She thanked him and walked out into the hard blue morning and got into the truck, the Montana Attorney General's office second. The complaint regarding the conduct of the former sheriff in 1998. The intake officer read the cover summary, looked up once, looked back down, and said someone from the Civil Rights Division would be in contact. She thanked him and walked out. The FBI field office in Salt Lake City received their packet by certified mail that same afternoon, sent from a post office on the way out of Billings. The packet contained Stephanie's 3 composition notebooks, Richard's complete files organized by date and category, the sworn statements they had collected, over 4 weeks from 11 people who had watched things happen in Harlan County, and never been asked to describe what they'd seen. The Ziploc bag, with the Zippo lighter photographed and labeled, the photocopy Betty Gonzalez had made in 1998 and kept in the bottom drawer of her desk for 20 years. And a cover letter written by Richard in the careful language of a former law enforcement officer who understood exactly what he was submitting and why. By the end of that week, the local Billings paper had the civil filing. By the end of the following week, a regional paper out of Denver had it. The week after that, 2 reporters with cameras arrived in Harlan and started knocking on doors. The doors opened. Not all of them, but enough. People who had watched things happen in this county for 30 years and had calculated, each time, that speaking was more dangerous than silence, recalculated when a reporter with a notepad sat across from them. And the question was no longer whether to speak into a void, but whether to speak into a record that was already being made, with or without them. An elderly farmer named Kenneth Lee, 79 years old, white-haired and deliberate, told a reporter from the Denver paper that he had been present at Theodore Holt's house on the morning of the land signing in 1998 and had watched Thomas's notary guide, Theodore's hand across the page. Kenneth had been Theodore's neighbor for 40 years. He had known, watching, that Theodore didn't understand what he was signing. He had said nothing because he hadn't known what saying something would accomplish. Now he knew. A retired schoolteacher named Laura Clark gave a statement about the pattern of intimidation she'd observed, directed at families who'd resisted Thomas's purchase offers over 2 decades. She named 4 families. She had dates. The pattern was becoming visible in the way that patterns might become visible when enough people stop looking at their individual piece of it and start looking at the whole shape. Thomas's attorneys released a statement. It was long. It used words like baseless and politically motivated and meritless, which were the words attorneys used when they wanted to signal confidence and were not confident. Richard read the statement and set it down and said, "They're afraid of the Homestead Clause. They've looked at it and they know it holds." Caddy added the statement to the folder under the kitchen sink. The folder under the kitchen sink had become, by February, a second trunk. Not literally, but in the way that evidence accumulates when the collection of it becomes a practice rather than an event. She had been adding to it since October, one dated entry at a time, the way Margaret had added to her journal, the way Richard had added to his files, the way Stephanie had added to her notebooks, the way patient people build things that are meant to hold weight. The preliminary injunction application arrived at the federal district court and was assigned to Judge Morrison, who had a reputation for moving quickly on clear federal questions and the Homestead Trust Clause, Richard said, about as clear a federal question as the district had seen in years. Thomas's legal response arrived within 72 hours. It was extensive. It was expensive. It was, ultimately, not sufficient to explain away a 100-year-old federal addendum by pointing at 30 years of practice that had been conducted in ignorance of it. The practice did not erase the law. The preliminary injunction was granted in March. Thomas's access rights over the disputed strip of land were suspended pending final determination. His access to a significant portion of his eastern holdings was in legal limbo. Several lenders who had advanced credit against those holdings began asking questions that Thomas's attorneys had to field, and fielding them cost resources, and resources were not infinite, even for someone who had spent 30 years building an operation that looked, from the outside, like it had no ceiling. The ceiling had always been there. They had just found it. Barbara came back in January, not because Katie had reached out. She hadn't. She had respected the boundary from the clinic hallway the way she'd learned to respect most things that cost something, by acknowledging the cost and continuing to function. Barbara came on a Sunday afternoon with Sharon Ramirez in the passenger seat, and the particular posture of 2 people who have discussed something thoroughly enough to arrive at an agreement and are now committed to executing it. They got out of the truck together, walked to the porch together, stopped at the steps together. Barbara took her hat off, held it in both hands. "I owe you a conversation I should have had a month ago," she said. Katie waited. "Timothy told me what he'd been doing out here. Not after the accident. He'd told me in October, and I let myself pretend I hadn't understood what he meant, because the pretense was easier than the truth." She looked at her hat. "He saved your life under that beam, and I stood in a hospital hallway and spoke to you as if you were the reason he was in that room." A pause. "You weren't. The barn was, and the barn had been failing for 6 years before you came up that road." "Vera," Katie started. "Let me finish." Barbara looked up. "I was scared. When I'm scared, I find something to be angry at. It's a flaw I've had a long time and I'm working on it." She met Katie's eyes. "I'm sorry. That's the whole of it." Sharon stepped up to the same level. She had the look of someone who had driven an hour for this and was not going to waste the trip. "Word about what you and Richard and that woman with the notebooks have been building got to Billings," she said. "I heard it at a coffee shop from someone who'd seen the court filing. I called Barbara on Wednesday. She said she'd been sitting with this for 3 weeks already." Sharon looked at Katie steadily. Donald Thomas bought my building and raised my rent until I couldn't keep the lights on. I've been angry about that for months and I've been directing it wrong. She paused. Tell me what I can do. Barbara reached into her coat pocket, pulled out an envelope. Set it on the porch rail the way you set something down when you've been carrying it longer than you should have. Margaret left this with me 11 years ago, she said. She said to give it to whoever from her family came home. I should have given it to you in March. I held back because I was watching to see if you'd last. That was wrong. In the envelope, a check for $300 and a note in Margaret's handwriting. This is for the first thing you plant in spring. Not taxes, not repairs. Something living. So you remember what you're keeping it for. Katie held the note and looked at the oak tree in the east yard, bare-branched in January but alive, in the way that things that look dead in winter are alive, just holding what they have close to the center where it's protected. The tree had been there before anyone living could remember. Margaret had probably looked at it, the same way from the same approximate spot, Ruth before her. Joseph Holt before that, in 1923, when he'd filed the papers that were now going to cost Donald Thomas everything he'd spent 30 years building. She came down from the porch and put her arms around Barbara Garcia. Barbara was 71 years old and not a person who made a habit of being embraced, and she stood still for one beat and then put one hand on Katie's back, briefly, with the kind of restraint that means the gesture costs something, and she was offering it anyway. That was enough. When they stepped back, Barbara's eyes were not wet, but they were doing something adjacent to wet, and she looked past Katie at the house with its new porch post, and its patched walls and its repaired south side, and she said, "The house looks better. We've been working on it, I can see that." She put her hat back on. "What do you need from me and Sharon, specifically? We're not here to offer in general. We're here to help with specifics." Katie thought about what specifics meant at this point, what the next stage of the work required that she didn't have. Witnesses, she said. People who will sign sworn statements about what they saw in this county. People who knew Margaret, who watched the Ashby sale, who watched the years after Theodore signed those papers. Richard can notarize, but I need people willing to put their names on paper. Barbara nodded. I know 12 people, she said, at least. Some of them have been wanting to say something for years and didn't have a reason that felt solid enough. She looked at the folder Katie was holding. Give me a week. She got 11 sworn statements in 8 days. 11 people in Harlan County who had watched things happen and never been officially asked to describe what they'd seen, and who, when Katie knocked on their doors with a notebook and a specific question, talked. Because the question had finally been asked by the right person at the right time, with enough of the surrounding structure visible that speaking into it felt like contributing to something rather than shooting into a void. Richard notarized each statement. He had renewed his notarial commission privately every year since his retirement, he told her, just in case. He was a careful man. He had always been a careful man. She stopped being surprised by the ways his preparation had anticipated what they would need. Timothy came back on a Thursday in late January. She heard his truck on the road before she saw it. The particular sound of his engine, which she had learned the way you learn the sounds of a place you've been paying attention to. He drove slowly because the road was still icy in the shaded sections, and he was the kind of driver who adjusted to conditions rather than arguing with them. He parked and got out and crossed the yard and stopped at the porch rail. Didn't come up the steps. His arm was still in a partial brace, but he was moving with less compensation than he'd been moving with when she'd last seen him. Barbara doesn't know I'm here, he said. I figured. He looked at the house, at the work that had continued without him, at the new section of fencing on the north side that Gary had helped her put in when the ground was still soft enough to sink posts, at the repaired kitchen window that had been covered with plastic sheeting since October, and was now actual glass. I should have come sooner, he said. I used the shoulder as a reason not to. It wasn't the reason. What was the reason? A pause. The length of it was honest. I didn't know how to come back after what she said to you in that hallway. I thought if I showed up it would be asking you to pretend it hadn't happened, and I wasn't sure you could do that, or if you should. He shifted his weight. I wasn't sure what I was asking you for. You weren't asking me for anything. You were just standing in my yard. I was standing in your yard hoping you'd let me come back and do the work I should have been here doing for the past 2 months. She looked at him, at the brace on his arm, at the fact that he had driven on still icy roads from his mother's house in the next county, to stand at her porch rail and say this out loud. Instead of finding a more comfortable way to re-enter the situation, the north fence line needs posts on the far end before the ground freezes any deeper, she said. He nodded once. Saturday morning, he said. Saturday morning, he turned to go. Timothy, he stopped. Looked back at her over his shoulder. You pushed me out from under that beam. Whatever else is complicated about any of this, that part isn't. He was quiet for a moment. You'd have gotten clear on your own, he said. You were already moving, I don't know that, I do, said simply, as a statement of fact rather than reassurance. You're always already moving. He got back in his truck and drove away on the icy road. Carefully the way he did everything. She stood on the porch and watched the truck until it was gone. The January afternoon was going gray at the edges, and the temperature was dropping in the way it dropped this time of year. Not gradually, but all at once, as if a decision had been made somewhere above the cloud layer. She should go inside, bank the stove, start dinner. She stood on the porch a little longer. When Barbara had come with Sharon 2 weeks earlier, and Sharon had asked what Katie needed specifically, Katie had said witnesses, which was true. But there was another answer she could have given, which was, I need the people I've been trying not to need back. I need the people I let close because the work required it, and then lost because the work made them targets. I need the network that got severed in November, when the barn came down, and Barbara stood in a hallway and the weight of being a target became visible in its full shape. She hadn't said that because saying it out loud would have required acknowledging how much it had cost her when the network severed, and acknowledging that cost was not something she'd had time for in November or December or January. There had been too much else to hold together, but it was coming back now, piece by piece. Barbara, Sharon, Gary, who had never left but had been steadier since Barbara came back, as if her return had stabilized something in the field. Stephanie, who had stayed through January and February and showed no signs of leaving. And whose presence had become a different kind of structural element than Katie had initially understood. Not just the owner of essential evidence, but a person who knew what it meant to carry something this heavy, this far alone, and was not going to leave someone else in that position if she could prevent it. And now Timothy, who was coming back on Saturday to set fence posts in frozen ground, with a shoulder that wasn't fully healed yet. She went inside and banked the stove and started dinner. Ronald Sanchez arrived at Richard's cabin on a night in late August, when the summer had gone dry, and the grass on the hills was the pale gold of a season that had given what it had to give. Katie was there when he came. She had been meeting with Richard twice a week through the summer, as the civil case moved through its preliminary stages, and the AG complaint produced its slow cascade of document requests. And the FBI packet worked its way through whatever process federal packets worked through on the way to becoming something actionable. She heard the truck on the road before it came into view. A pickup that was not new and not maintained with pride. The truck of a person who used a vehicle without considering what it said about him. He parked and got out and stood in the yard for a moment before walking to the door, which was the body language of someone who has been deciding something for a long time and has arrived at the decision but hasn't fully made peace with it yet. Richard let him in. Ronald Sanchez, 47 years old, farm manager for the Thomas operation for 19 years. A large man who had gone slightly soft in the way that large men who do physical work all their lives go soft when the physical work decreases, though his hands still had the specific callousing of someone who had spent decades with machinery and fencing, and the particular tools of agricultural management. He sat down at the table without being invited to, which was not rudeness. It was the manner of a person who isn't sure their legs will hold them through the formality of waiting to be asked. He put a Zippo lighter on the table. Chromie. Good condition, engraved on the side in a cattle brand script. Crane Farm Co., identical to the one in the Ziploc bag in Katie's kitchen. I hired the man who came to your property in November, he said. He was looking at the lighter, not at either of them, Thomas gave me the instruction. I was told what to do and when and to make sure nothing came back to the main office. I did it because I'd been doing what I was told for 19 years, and the habit was stronger than the judgment. Richard said nothing. Katie said nothing. The only sound was the wood stove and the summer insects outside the window, which were abundant and indifferent. I recorded the conversation where he gave me the instruction, Ronald continued. On my phone. In my truck, the morning the order came. I did it because I was scared and I wanted to have something. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. Why now? Richard said. Ronald's hands were flat on the table. He was a man in his late 40s who had spent 19 years working for a person who paid well and asked for things that seemed, each time individually, like the kind of small compromises that life in this county required. Until they didn't seem small anymore. Until the accumulation of them had made him into someone he needed to describe to himself in ways he didn't like. "My daughter," he said. "She's 17. Her best friend's father is on the list. One of the 9 names in those notebooks." He stopped. Started again. "I've been quiet for 19 years. I've been watching what quiet produces. I'm done with what it produces." He looked up. "My daughter doesn't know any of this. When she finds out, which she will when this goes to trial, I want her to find out that I was on the right side of it." Even if the right side came late, he reached into his jacket pocket and put a small digital recorder on the table beside the lighter. "The conversation is on there," he said. "I transferred it from the phone last year when I got a new one. I've been carrying it for 8 months trying to decide." Richard reached out and picked up the recorder, held it for a moment, set it back down. "We'll need a sworn statement," he said, describing the instruction, the recording, the chain of custody. "And you'll need to be willing to testify. I know. Patricia Johnson is the attorney handling the civil case. She'll want to speak with you before the trial. She has specific requirements for witness preparation. I know that too." Ronald looked at Katie for the first time since he'd sat down. "I heard about your mother. What she tried to do in 1998 and what happened after." He paused. "She was doing the right thing. She deserved someone who would have helped her do it." Katie looked at him. "You can help now," she said. "That's what matters." Patricia Johnson had not put Ronald's name on the witness roster when she filed the final pre-trial documentation. This was a deliberate decision. She told Katie and Richard when she made it. If Thomas's legal team knows he's coming, they'll prepare to discredit him, and they'll potentially create pressure on him or his family before he takes the stand. He goes on the list the morning he testifies. Not before. The trial date was set for October 7th. Donald Thomas made his last visit to the farm on a morning in late September, the first warm day in weeks. The snow was off the south-facing slope of the property. The first green of whatever grew in fall was showing at the edges of things. Katie was on the roof, which had been her position on a lot of mornings, because the roof always had something that needed attention, and being on the roof gave her a view of the whole property that she found useful for thinking. She heard the truck. Came down the ladder. He rolled his window down and rested his arm on the doorframe. He didn't get out. That was different from October, from the other visits. He was not going to stand on the ground of a farm he hadn't been able to acquire and perform the posture of someone who had options. He looked older, not dramatically, but the legal process had a quality that showed in faces eventually, the quality of sustained alertness that replaced what used to be ease, the particular tightening around the eyes of someone who has been adding up numbers and not getting an answer they like. 100,000, he said. Drop the civil suit. Withdraw the AG complaint. Sign a comprehensive release. Walk away with enough to start over anywhere you choose. She looked at him. My great-great-grandmother turned down 150,000 from you, she said. She chose to die in this house instead. I'm not going to take your money. I'm going to take what she built. She kept her voice flat, even. The voice of a person stating a fact rather than making an argument. What she built is a 30-year record of everything you've done in this county. It's in front of 3 different courts right now. The only thing any amount of money can do for you at this point is pay for better lawyers. His jaw was tight. You're 19 years old, he said. You don't understand what you're walking into. I walked into a county auction with $7 and I'm still standing here, she said. I think I understand something about what I'm walking into. He looked at her for a long moment, not angry, not anymore. Something past anger, the look of a man who has spent 30 years operating on the premise that he was the most patient person in every room he entered and has just understood, finally, that he was wrong about that. That the most patient person in every room he'd entered for 30 years had been an 84-year-old woman at the end of a dirt road who had been watching and writing and waiting, and that her patience had outlasted his by the specific margin of one granddaughter who had shown up with $7 and no intention of leaving. He rolled his window up. He drove away. Katie watched the truck until the dust settled back to the road. Then she stood in the yard for a moment with the September sun on her face, and the sound of the farm around her, the wind in the grass, and the distant sound of Finn and Hazel in the yard behind the house. where Stephanie had been teaching them to plant things in the garden beds that the previous family who'd stayed had rebuilt. She went inside and opened her notebook, wrote the date, wrote the figure he'd offered, wrote his exact words, as close as she could render them, wrote, "Final visit," closed the notebook, went back up the ladder. There was still work to do on the roof. The courthouse in Harlan held 42 seats, and every one of them was filled by 8:50 on the morning of October 7th. People had driven from Billings, from Bozeman, from ranches and small towns across 2 counties. 2 men in the back row had grown up in Harlan in the 1950s and moved away decades ago, and had driven back when the news reached them through whatever channel's news traveled in places where the connections between people ran deep and long. They sat very straight and did not speak to anyone around them, and watched everything with the focused attention of people who understood that they were witnessing something they had not expected to live to see. Katie sat at the plaintiff's table next to Patricia Johnson, who had the settled posture of someone who has been in courtrooms her entire professional life and stopped being impressed by their architecture decades ago. Patricia was 68 years old, gray-haired, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the particular directness of a lawyer who had spent a career saying precisely what she meant and had no patience left for the alternative. Richard sat in the first gallery row. Stephanie beside him, her 3 composition notebooks in a bag at her feet because she had carried them this far and was not going to leave them in the truck. Barbara and Sharon sat on Richard's other side. Gary Young, now 15, sat 2 rows back with the contained alertness he'd brought to every task since Katie had met him. Timothy Clark sat in the second row. His shoulder had healed. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the front of the room, and his expression was the expression he wore when he was paying complete attention to something, which looked from the outside like no expression at all, but was the opposite of that. Donald Thomas sat at the defense table with 3 attorneys from Denver. The lead was a man named Foley who had a reputation for grinding smaller opponents into the floors of small courtrooms, and had spent 30 years earning that reputation. He wore it the way certain people wear experience, not as weight but as a kind of ambient authority. He looked at the plaintiff's table and at Patricia Johnson, and something in his assessment recalibrated slightly, the way a person's assessment recalibrates when they recognize someone. He and Patricia had been at opposing tables before, a long time ago, in a different county. Patricia had won that case too. Judge Morrison called the court to order at 9 o'clock exactly. He looked across the bench at Katie, Miss Holt. "The court has reviewed the preliminary filings, but I want to hear it from you directly. Tell me how this began." She stood up. She walked to the witness chair and sat down and took the oath and looked at the room, and then at the judge, and then she began. She told it in the sequence it had happened. The cardboard box, 3 things inside it: a ring with initials, a birth certificate, a Polaroid photograph with a reflection in the window glass behind the young woman's shoulder, a man standing on the road watching her have her picture taken, a man Katie wouldn't identify until October of the following year when he drove up her road with clean boots, and a paper held between 2 fingers, the auction, $7. The receipt still in her jacket pocket on the day she testified, the hiding place, the 11 never stop non-ring, and the $100 red journal and the 47 letters returned to sender, and 13 birthday cards addressed to a child Margaret had never met and had written to anyway, because certain things deserve to be marked, even when there is no one to receive them. The journal, what it contained. 30 years of documentation in careful handwriting, dates and names and license plates, and photographs taken through glass, 1 name appearing on every page from the first year to the last. She told them about Olivia. She told it without performance. Her mother at 17, walking into an office that was supposed to be safe, trying to do what needed doing in a county where the official responsible for doing the right thing was owned by the person she was trying to stop. The evidence file suppressed within 24 hours. The call Richard had received that night. Olivia gone 2 weeks later. Dead at 21 in Nebraska without ever coming home, carrying a letter she'd never answered, and a photograph she'd never stopped keeping, and a secret that had outlived her by 18 years, until her daughter found it in a cardboard box in the office of a group home and followed it back to Montana. Patricia entered the photocopy Betty Gonzalez had kept in her desk drawer for 20 years. Foley objected to chain of custody. Judge Morrison looked at him over the rim of his glasses with the specific patience of a judge who has been on the bench long enough to have heard every objection and has opinions about which ones are worth his time. The original was destroyed in 1998 by the office that was supposed to preserve it, he said. We are admitting the copy. Sit down, counsel. Foley sat. Patricia entered the 1923 Homestead Papers. She entered the journal. She entered Richard's files. 6 inches of organized documentation. She entered 11 sworn statements. Foley objected to each one. He was overruled to each one. By the 6th overruling, the gallery had stopped reacting to cycle and was simply watching Foley with a particular quality of attention reserved for someone who is trying very hard and not getting anywhere. Richard took the stand on the second day. He told the truth in the register he'd been using his entire adult life. Methodical, complete, without flourish or embellishment, answering every question with the specific accuracy of a man who understood that accuracy was the only tool a witness had and everything else was noise. He described the 1998 night in detail, the girl who had walked into his office, what she'd brought, the call that came afterward, the decision he'd made and the cost of that decision across 20 years of living with it. Foley cross-examined him for 2 hours. Richard answered every question in the same register, the same pace, the voice of a man who had given testimony under oath dozens of times and understood that patience was the most effective thing available to a witness who was telling the truth. He was not rattled. He was not rushed. He had been a patient man for too long to be destabilized by a man in a well-cut suit who was running out of angles. Near the end, Foley said, "Mr. Miller, are you asking this court to believe that for 16 years after your retirement, you maintained evidence in a private residence and waited for a teenager to come looking for it?" Richard didn't look at Foley when he answered. He looked at Katie. "I'm not asking the court to believe it," he said. "I'm telling the court it happened. And why would you do that?" "Because Margaret Holt asked me to," he said. "And there are people whose requests carry a weight that doesn't expire when they do." The gallery was very quiet. The man in the back row with the bolo tie took a handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it under one eye, and returned it without changing his expression. Stephanie testified on the 3rd day. She read from her notebooks with the composure of someone who has processed her grief, past the point where it operates on the surface, and has become instead something that powers forward motion. 9 names. 15 years. His phone never stopped ringing, the specific institutional indifference she had encountered at every county and state office she'd approached, the pattern of closed cases and retired officials and properties acquired on salaries that couldn't have paid for them. When she finished, she closed her notebook and set it on the rail beside her and looked at the room. Ronald Sanchez was the first witness on the 4th day. Patricia had not listed his name on the official roster until the morning he was called. Thomas's lead attorney looked at the name on the day's schedule, and something moved in his posture that was small but visible to anyone paying attention. Ronald sat in the witness chair, with his hands flat on his thighs, and stated clearly that he had contracted the man who came to Katie's property in November of the previous year, with a can of gasoline and a specific instruction. He stated that the instruction had come directly from Donald Thomas. He stated that he had recorded the conversation in which the instruction was given, on his phone, in his truck, on the morning the order was delivered. Patricia played the recording through the courtroom speakers. Donald Thomas's voice, clear and unhurried, in a room that had been private and was now the most public room in Harlan County. "Make sure there's nothing left of that barn, and make sure there's no trail back to this office." The gallery absorbed that sentence in total silence, not the silence of an audience receiving information. The silence of people who have suspected something for a long time, and are hearing, for the first time, the specific shape of the confirmation. The silence had a texture to it. It had weight. Judge Morrison listened to the full recording. When it finished, he let the silence remain for an additional moment before he said anything. Then he set down his pen, which he'd been holding throughout the testimony, and looked at the defense table. "Court will recess until 2 o'clock this afternoon," he said. "Counsel, my chambers." Both sides, the gavel came down. Katie sat at the plaintiff's table while the gallery rustled and shifted around her, and Patricia leaned over and said, quietly, "They're going to ask to discuss a stipulated judgment on the civil matters. Should we?" Patricia looked at her. "That depends on what you want." Katie thought about Margaret, about 30 years of a journal, about the choice to not fight Thomas in 1985 or 1989 or 1992, to instead document and wait, and build the kind of case that didn't give him a side door to exit through when it finally came. She wanted him to lose everything, Katie said. not to walk away with a settlement he could live with. Then we don't agree to the civil stipulation. Patricia gathered her papers. We let the judgment stand and we let the consequences be what they are. The chambers meeting lasted 40 minutes. Foley came back with the specific posture of a man who has had the numbers explained to him from multiple directions and has arrived at the same answer each time. He went to Thomas and spoke quietly for a long time. Thomas shook his head twice. The third time he stopped shaking it and looked at the table, and then he nodded, slightly, the nod of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. Foley stood up, Your Honor. The defense concedes on the civil land transfer claim and will not contest the Homestead Trust determination. We request a formal ruling. Judge Morrison looked at him for a moment. Then he picked up his pen. The ruling came down at 4:15. The 1998 transfer of Theodore Holt's land to Donald Thomas was void from the date it was executed. Title to the disputed strip returned in full to the Holt estate. The civil claims for fraud, witness intimidation, and the arson attempt were resolved in the plaintiff's favor on all counts. The federal grand jury in Salt Lake City, his phone, which had been convened in the spring based on the FBI packet and had been working quietly through the summer while the civil case moved through its stages, would address the criminal matters in a separate proceeding. Patricia told Katie what the damages figure would be and also told her it would be difficult to collect, because by the time the federal criminal case ran its course, Thomas would not have the assets to satisfy it. She was right. She was right about most things, which was the quality that had made her worth driving from Denver for $25 and a handshake. The federal indictment came in the spring. 63 pages. Wire fraud, witness intimidation, conspiracy, the deaths of 9 men over 15 years in 3 states. Thomas was not convicted of murder. The evidentiary standard for the criminal charges required certainty that the jury could not reach on those specific counts. But he was convicted on the fraud and intimidation counts, 4 years. A federal facility in Colorado. During those 4 years, his wife filed for divorce. 2 banks called their loans. The ranch went into receivership. The entity names that had appeared in 3 states worth of property, documents, and insurance filings were dissolved one by one, as the assets behind them were liquidated to satisfy creditors and court orders. By the time he walked out of federal custody, the Thomas operation in Harlan County was a legal designation attached to nothing. The land had been sold to 3 separate buyers. The Crane Farm Co. holding company had been administratively dissolved. His name no longer appeared on any document in the county recorder's office, except as a historical party to transactions that were now in dispute or had been unwound. He moved to a small town in eastern Wyoming. He did not come back to Harlan County. Not then. Not ever. People who had been in the courtroom told Katie afterward that he had not looked at her once during the 4 days of testimony. Not once, in 4 days, in a room where she was the most important person present, as if by declining to look at her directly he could maintain some version of a reality in which she had not happened to him. She thought about this sometimes. She found that it didn't matter to her the way she would have expected it to. She had not done this to be seen by him. She had done it because something needed doing and she was the one standing there when it needed to be done. That was sufficient. That had always been sufficient. The lantern in the window had started in December, the first winter, after Stephanie's car went into the ditch at the property line. Katie had understood, watching those headlights come over the rise and swing wrong on the ice, that the road out front was dark in a way that people coming from the north didn't anticipate, and a light in a window was the most basic offer a place could make. Someone is here, there is warmth. You are not as lost as you thought. She had kept it lit every night after that, from dusk to dawn. Not as a signal to anyone specific, just as a practice. The practice of leaving a door open even when you don't know who is going to walk through it. By the 2nd year, people in Harlan were calling it the Lighthouse. Not because she'd named it that. The name had come from town, from Barbara's store, and Sharon's second location when she reopened, from the feed store and the post office, and the truckers who passed on the highway south of the river and had heard about it from somewhere and told someone else. A woman from Billings who couldn't make rent stayed 6 weeks and helped with the fence line. A family with a broken engine stayed 3 weeks and rebuilt the garden beds. A boy of 17 aged out of the foster system in August stayed 3 years until he had enough saved from working at Barbara's store to enroll in a community college in Bozeman. He left on a Tuesday morning with a handshake and a jar of seeds from the garden and the particular posture of a person who has been given enough time in a place to understand what enough time in a place can do. Katie did not put up a sign, did not make any announcement. The lantern was the only marker. But people found it. In the autumn of the third year, after the verdict and the receivership and all the legal aftermath had settled into its permanent positions, she planted the apple tree. She had been waiting for the right place and the right time since Barbara had given her Margaret's $300 in January. The tree went in the south yard, where the light was good and the drainage was better than the east side, which Gary had identified without being asked, because Gary had continued to appear with specific, correct information at the specific moment she needed it, which was one of the more reliable things in her life. She planted it on a Saturday morning with Gary holding one side of the root ball, and Timothy holding the other, and Finn insisting on being the one to pour the first bucket of water, which was not negotiable. She stood next to the tree when it was done and looked at it. Small, not impressive yet. Not the thing it would eventually become. Just a young tree standing in a patch of turned soil in the south yard of an 80-acre farm in Montana, planted with $300 a dead woman had set aside 11 years ago for this specific purpose. Not for a tree, exactly. For whatever the first living thing was that the right person planted in the right moment for the right reason. A thing that would grow whether or not the person who planted it was there to see it. That was the whole of the instruction. That was everything Margaret had been trying to say with $300, and a note written in her careful handwriting, and kept in an envelope in Barbara's coat pocket for 11 years waiting. Keep the light on. Plant the thing that grows. Not for yourself, for whoever comes after. She thought about her mother, 21 years old in Nebraska, carrying a letter she'd never answered and a photograph she'd never stopped keeping. What Olivia had preserved by running, by staying alive, by keeping the thread of knowledge intact, even when she had no way to use it, was not the evidence itself. The evidence had died with Olivia, had vanished into whatever she'd carried it in, had not survived her in any form that could be accessed. What she'd preserved was the thread back, the address on a photograph, the location on the back of a Polaroid in careful cursive. Rimrock and then Harlan, and then a county library database and a county auction, and $7 and a receipt held in both hands so they wouldn't shake. Olivia had not been able to finish it. But she had made it possible for someone to finish it. She had kept the thread and the thread had held, and here was the end of it. A farm that was whole, a lantern in the window, an apple tree in the south yard, and a daughter who had come home 18 years late and found everything waiting. On the night of the third autumn, after the dishes were done, and Finn and Hazel were asleep, and Stephanie had gone to bed with her book, Katie sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the lantern in the window. The road from town was dark, the wind was small. Somewhere out in the fields a coyote called once and then was silent. 2 headlights appeared on the rise about a mile out, moving slowly, with the particular uncertainty of someone who doesn't know this road. The car stopped at the bottom of the drive. A door opened. A boy, 17 maybe, thin coat, backpack on one shoulder. The particular walk of someone who has been moving a long time towards something they weren't certain existed when they started moving toward it. He came up the drive slowly and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at the lantern in the window. "I heard there's a place out here," he said. His voice was rough with cold, and whatever the months before this night had cost him. "I heard the lights on." Katie set her coffee down. She stood up and came to the top of the steps and looked at him. His face in the lantern light, the eyes. Every kid she had ever been, in every bus station and shelter and group home cafeteria, smelling of powdered milk and cleaning solution diluted too far with water. "It's on," she said. "Come in." He started to cry, tried not to, couldn't stop. She put her hand on his shoulder and walked him through the front door into the warm yellow light of the room. Margaret Holt had kept ready for 60 years, on the chance that someone would finally come through it and need what was on the other side. The wind moved across 80 acres of Montana grassland that had once cost $7 and had always been worth everything. The lantern burned in the window, and in whatever quiet place she had gone to, Katie hoped Margaret could see it, the light she had asked to be kept, still burning, for whoever came after, for whoever was always going to come after.